Thank you, Julie. The horror continues to escalate in Syria. Now among the deadliest conflicts of the Arab Spring, the U.S. has closed its embassy there, but that's not the only hotspot in the Middle East. The U.S. is stepping up pressure on Iran over its nuclear ambitions, and officials hint at withholding aid from Egypt as Americans face legal charges there. Joining us to talk about all of this is our friend Aziz Abu Sarah, the co-executive director of the Center for World Religions, Citizen Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. I believe that is the longest title of any guest that we've had on the show.
I always have to apologize first for the length of the title, but we try to put everything together.
That is quite all right. Let's jump in. There's a lot to talk about. Let's talk about Syria first. We've withdrawn our ambassador. Britain has done the same thing. Is this going to put more pressure on President Assad to step down?
No, not really. I think, well, the ambassador has been back to the States already for a while. They're closing the embassy and the lower-level employees are leaving now, but it's not going to really make a lot of difference. Also, some Arab countries have been withdrawing their ambassadors or asking the Syrian ambassadors to leave, but that's not going to make enough pressure. It comes down to what the Arab League now going to do, what Turkey especially is going to do, as the UN is failing to really be united in one front against the Syrian regime. Syrians in many ways are left alone at this moment.
And there's some confusion in Syria because the rebels there are various sects that are involved in this as well.
Yes.
Too. Does that make it harder for outsiders to kind of manage what's going on there?
Yes, I mean, Syrian is very many minorities. It's not just a one major majority and then small minority, but many minorities that in the country. You have the Christians, you have the Kurds, you have even within the Christians different group, then you have within the Sunnis different group. So it makes it a lot more complicated, but that's one of the problems of the opposition, is that it's also fragmented and there's different parts within the opposition that's not sometimes able to come together in opposing the regime.
Could we see NATO forces intervene?
I don't think anytime soon, and mainly because of the lack of support, international support. You have China against it and you have Russia against it. That wasn't the case in Libya. In Libya, there was enough negotiations that got Russia and China to stay silent, say, okay, let it happen, and went it through the UN. I don't think that will happen, unfortunately, or fortunately, in this case. I think we will have to trust and work together with the neighbors of Syria, specifically, again, Turkey, Jordan, the countries that bordering.
One more question about Syria, then I want to move to Iran. You mentioned Russia and China. They are, more or less now supporting the Assad regime. Does that put us or the West on a collision course with them now?
No, not necessarily. I think they both have, each one has their own interests. And when you look at the Middle East, each country has its own allies and wants to protect those allies. And Russia and China have lost some of those allies recently. So when they're looking at Syria and looking at Iran specifically, they're looking at the last two allies they have in the region. They don't want to lose them. So toppling the regime there for them is against their interests. So they're not looking at the human rights aspect. They're looking at what will we benefit out of this. We're going to lose all our places in the Middle East. No, we prefer to keep this regime. We will try to find a way that is good for everybody, but not losing our ally.
Let's turn to Iran. President Obama wants to increase or toughen the sanctions against Iran. What is life? Do we have a sense of what life is like right now for the average Iranian citizen under these sanctions?
That's a brilliant question, because often what happens with sanctions, it's supposed to go against the elites, but it ends up going against the people of those countries. We saw the same thing happening in Iraq before, where millions of Iraqis suffered, hundreds of thousands died through those regimes, and that's the fear of those sanctions. Now, many of those sanctions are new that's being introduced, so we still haven't felt their effect in Iran, but the fear is it's going to hurt the people instead of hurting the regime. And if that happens, you end up aligning the opposition with the Iranian regime instead of creating stronger opposition in Iran.
In Egypt, we see Sam Lahoud, the son of the Transportation Secretary, and others, about 20 others, who are going to go to trial now in Egypt. What can the U.S. do to circumvent that? Do we have any influence there to kind of get them out of there?
There'll be a lot of diplomatic relations, and I think the relationship is still between the U.S. and the Egyptian ruling, the military, is still good enough to work it through it. There are some major disagreements in how fast Egypt is moving toward democracy. The military in Egypt is not happy with the calls, the interventions of outsiders saying we need to move faster toward democracy, we need to get the military off and get the civilian regime, democracy. So, but there's still a lot of relationship between the two sides. Remember, America still gives over $1 billion to Egypt, and that gives you a lot of place to deal with Egyptians. But Egypt is going to be unstable for a while, and we have to get used to that. After a revolution, the pattern of revolutions, there's never a stability right away after a revolution. Right. It takes sometimes a few years until we get to the place we want to, and we will see possibly even second and third revolutions in some of these countries, because that's how it goes.
Possibly. Now it looks like the elections are going to be moved up in Egypt, so that's one sign of hope. Aziz Abu Sarah, thank you very much for coming in. Always good to have you here. And I'm sure we'll have you back again sometime soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Allison, back to you.